Hello everyone! Many of the recent Genshin betas have been relatively uneventful for most of the weeks, but the third week of betas are typically when characters get the most influential changes, sometimes even their final changes before their release. And with Skirk, she did get some minor but somewhat impactful changes to her kit in the third week of the Genshin 5.7 beta. Same thing applies to Dahlia. But on top of that, some surprising new info on Skirk's optimal attack combos from private server footage recently released, which may result in the most significant damage increase that Skirk has received out of all of her changes. So I wanted to cover all the recent notable kit updates, mainly for Skirk, and analyze the impact of those changes on her overall meta performance as a potential top tier DPS. Before I get into the kit changes made in the third week of the beta, let's first quickly go over the small changes and new info about Skirk that were introduced in the second week of her beta. There were three main updates. First, the stat distribution of her signature weapon was changed. Instead of having 608 base attack and 33% crit rate, it now gives 674 base attack and 22% crit rate. Because Skirk's teams don't give that much attack, the increased base attack is more beneficial for Skirk and makes any attack percent buffs a bit better, resulting in about a 1 to 2% overall buff, so nothing too major. The main consequence of this change, however, is that with a lower crit rate substat, it is much easier to use 4-piece Marichuzi Hunter without overcapping on crit rate with her signature, giving her already general best artifact set, assuming Farina is on the team, even more use cases. Second, Skirk's particle generation was changed. Originally, only the first charge attack after entering her enhanced state generated 4 particles, meaning that her burst playstyle didn't give energy to the team. Now, Skirk generates particles whenever she deals cryo damage to an enemy with a 15-second cooldown. This means that an enhanced normal attack and even the damage from her burst will produce the 4 cryo particles. Of course, this energy isn't important for Skirk, but very important for her teammates. And third, while it isn't a kit change, we did get some more information about how Skirk's special resource, Serpent Subtlety, functions, specifically in Spiral Abyss. On Chamber 1, Skirk initially starts with a full 100 Serpent Subtlety, and any stacks that she has when the chamber ends will carry over to the next chamber. So if you end Chamber 1 with 20 Serpent Subtlety, at the start of Chamber 2, Skirk will have 20 Serpent Subtlety. Now what does this mean for Skirk? This means that on the first rotation, Skirk can use her burst as well as on field with her normal attacks for a damage gain without being forced to use only one or the other due to Serpent Subtlety availability. You can do it at the start of Chamber 1 every time, since Skirk will always start with 100 Serpent Subtlety in the first chamber of Spiral Abyss, but you can also do it at the starts of Chamber 2 and 3 if you keep at least 17 stacks when you end the previous chamber. Then on the next chamber, you can start with a hold E before immediately swapping out, which gives 45 stacks, and 45 plus 17 is enough for her max damage burst. While this is definitely a nice damage increase, it isn't an insane damage increase that some people may say, since the burst only works on the first rotation. So once you consider the subsequent rotations without a burst, the DPS averages out to be lower than when you just consider the first rotation. With the second week beta changes out of the way, let's discuss the Skirk changes made in the third week of her beta. These kit changes are also quite straightforward and minor in the grand scheme of things, but they do result in some nice buffs for Skirk. First, they changed the multipliers of her burst. The base damage of the burst was decreased, but the extra damage the burst gets when more than 50 Serpent Subtlety is consumed was increased. You pretty much always want to consume at least 62 Serpent Subtlety when using Skirk's burst to get the maximum damage buff on it, since the damage buff is very significant to make the burst deal a lot of damage. So when comparing the total max motion value of the burst pre and post change, we see that the burst got about an extra 300 motion value with the recent changes, resulting in about a 5% damage buff on the burst. Obviously, in rotations where you don't use Skirk's burst, this doesn't matter. However, with the ability of Skirk bursting in her first rotations to Spiral Abyss, and the existence of split uptime rotations where you can use Skirk's burst and on-field playstyles together every rotation while stalling the downtime by refreshing support skills, Skirk's slight burst damage buff is quite relevant, and she will be able to take advantage of it in practice. Second is a buff to Skirk's C2. The additional Serpent stacks that can be used to increase her burst damage was decreased from 12 to 10, but with the multiplier buff it received, it's still an overall slight increase in burst damage. And in addition, the second portion of her C2 was changed from just giving 60% normal attack damage bonus to giving 60% attack. However, instead of this damage buff always being active, the 60% attack will only be given when she uses her special burst that doesn't do damage, and the buff will end when she exits her enhanced on-field state. Not only is the attack percent buff more valuable for Skirk than damage percent, but the buff being attack percent also means that the extra damage she gets from absorbing rifts with C1 also get buffed with C2. The buff being tied to using her special burst, which activates when she presses her skill, makes it much more important to use, making normal rotations for on-field Skirk much more powerful. The last and most straightforward beta change made to Skirk's kit is with her skill cooldown, which was decreased by 1 second. While this buff seems very simple and inconsequential, it is arguably one of the most important buffs that Skirk received out of all of her beta kit changes. If we look strictly on sheet DPS, a 1 second shorter skill cooldown on Skirk means that her normal rotation is 1 second shorter, 1.5 seconds shorter if you follow the current sims. Shorter rotation times mathematically translates to a higher DPS number on paper, so the 1 second cooldown decrease on Skirk's skill results in about a 5% DPS buff in team DPS calcs. However, the shorter cooldown doesn't affect the rotation time of all of Skirk's current rotations, because some rotations aren't limited by Skirk's skill cooldown but by other teammates. For instance, in Skirk's split uptime rotation that was TC'd by vomfee, the rotation remains 30 seconds long because the limiting cooldown is Escoffier's skill, which has a 15-second cooldown. Escoffier's skill is used twice within this rotation to refresh its duration, and 15 seconds plus 15 seconds is 30 seconds. But regardless of whether Skirk's shorter skill cooldown decreases the overall rotation time or not, the most important part of this buff isn't the minor sheet DPS increase it can provide, but the increased quality of life in Skirk's actual gameplay. Most support setups, including Skirk supports, take about 8 seconds for all their skills and bursts to be used before swapping to the main DPS. With Skirk's original skill cooldown of 9 seconds, if you pressed her buttons very well, there could be a scenario where once you swap to Skirk, her skill would still be on cooldown for 1 second from the end of the previous rotation, or if you held the skill at the start to charge a burst, and waiting for 1 second would be kind of annoying. With the 1 second decrease in this cooldown, this shouldn't be an issue anymore, making Skirk much more comfortable and fluid to play regardless of whether her overall rotation was made shorter or not with this buff. Dahlia also got 2 small changes in the 3rd week of beta, so to not forget about his existence, let's quickly go over them. First, his shield's HP scaling was increased, but the total amount of shields he can create with his venison stacks was decreased from 5 to 4, and after doing the math, the total effective shield HP hasn't actually really changed. The main significance of this change is that you don't need to rely on as many normal attacks as before in order to get all his shield refreshes, since you only need 4 stacks instead of 5. In fact, theoretically, you could just trigger freeze twice in a rotation and you would get the max amount of shield from Dahlia's A1 passive without relying on normal attacks at all. Second, Dahlia's attack speed buff from his A4 passive was buffed. At C0, Dahlia now gives a max of 20% attack speed instead of 15% as long as Dahlia has 40,000 HP. Including the C6, Dahlia can now give up to 30% attack speed. I don't think 5% extra attack speed is that impactful of a change. For instance, private server footage has shown that C0 Dahlia can give Skirk 1 extra normal attack and C6 can give her 2 extra normal attacks. 5% extra attack speed should make this easier and more comfortable to achieve, but I don't think it will allow Skirk to get any more attacks. And with that, we've covered all the relevant beta changes as of now. One final thing that was added in the beta was Skirk and Dahlia's birthdays, and of course, as with all betas, the addition of the birthdays typically means that character kits are pretty much finalized and ready to be shipped for official release. So yes, Dahlia will just be a shielder and attack speed buffer, and Skirk is keeping her team building restrictions. Now this would have been the end of the video, but very recently, some private server footage of Skirk's gameplay released showing her potentially new optimal rotation, impacting Skirk's power level as a DPS. For Skirk's on-field playstyle, most theory crafters assumed 3 N5s and N4 and 1 or 2 charge attacks depending on whether you use their special burst within each of her enhanced states based on previous available footage, and this would form the safe baseline for Skirk's rotation in team DPS calcs. The newest footage, however, implements charge attack and dash cancels and allows Skirk to fit in more attacks than initially assumed. In total with the cancels, Skirk can now get 4 N5s and N1 and 2 charge attacks, so 2 extra attacks, which is actually pretty significant when optimizing Skirk's damage. Theorycrafter vomfee was able to incorporate the new rotation in his calcs, which results in about a 10% damage increase for Skirk herself, or an overall 4% team damage increase. If we just focus on the DPS number, Skirk is solidifying herself as the clear second best DPS in the game damage wise, and if we do consider enemies that are able to be frozen, which means 100% cryo resistance uptime, Skirk is able to reach baseline Mavuika melt damage numbers. Now whether or not this new rotation is easy to pull off in practice for most people remains to be seen, but the new rotation nevertheless looks promising in terms of optimization, and I'm optimistic that the new rotation will be accessible with enough practice. I hope this beta update and analysis video was in any way helpful. Of course, thank you to vomfee for all the TC and calcs shown in this video. If you enjoyed, feel free to drop a like for the video or sub to the channel so you don't miss out on any pre-release Genshin guides and analysis videos in the future. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day.